Today's story is called The ANZAC Violin. It's a true story about Alexander Aitken, as told by Jennifer Beck and illustrated by Robyn Belton. August the 14th, 1915. 6 reinforcements, NZEF. It was just a cheap violin, an unwanted prize in a shipboard raffle. The year was 1915, and the troop ship was packed with young men from New Zealand. They were on their way to fight the Great War in Europe. "This violin's no use to me," shrugged the winner. "I can't play a note." He turned to a former Otago schoolmate. "Hey, Alec, you're good at music. You might as well have it." Alexander Aitken hesitated. "I'd like to take it, but I haven't been learning the violin for long." His Dunedin mates laughed. "Knowing you, 1 session is all you'd need." Alexander had been a top student at school and was well known for his amazing memory. The voyage on the crowded ship was long and uncomfortable. To help pass the time, Alexander practiced playing the violin. The music brought back happy memories of family gatherings around the piano. At last, the ship reached Cairo in Egypt, and the men were glad to spend some time on shore. Some of them would gather around Alexander's tent in the evening, listening to the music. "Play our favourite," someone would call, and once again the strains of Humoresque would drift across the desert. When the order came to shift camp and move closer to the battle zone in Turkey, Alexander was faced with a dilemma. He knew the army regulations were strict. Excess baggage must be left behind. But he had already begun to print place names inside the lining of the violin case. He had recorded places they had passed through, from the Indian Ocean to Cairo. Now what lies ahead for us? Alexander wondered. How many more places will we get to see? He decided he would play music for as long as he could. His comrades helped by secretly passing the violin from hand to hand during kit inspections by the officers. Sometimes the army cooks hid it among their pots and pans. In this way, they managed to smuggle the violin onto the ship and all the way to Gallipoli. It was nearly midnight when they anchored off ANZAC Cove. There were stars, but no moon. The jagged ridge of the Gallipoli Peninsula loomed dark above them. Machine guns rattled in the distance. Silently, the troops climbed down steep ladders to the boats that would ferry them to shore. Enemy bullets splashed into the sea around the overloaded boats. Weighed down by the heavy pack on his back, Alexander still managed to hold the violin case in one hand. When they reached land, British troops helped pull the men up onto the pier. "God blimey," one of them exclaimed when he saw what Alexander was holding. In the dangerous days that followed, the soldiers had to clamber under gunfire up steep slopes of crumbling clay. They struggled through thorny scrub. Many times Alexander felt like throwing the violin into the gully. But always a grimy hand would reach out and one of his mates would say, "Pass it here, cobber, I'll carry it for you." The men fought their way up the ridge towards the top of Chinook Bear. When an Australian stretcher bearer saw the violin, he offered to store it in his dugout. "It might be safer in there," he said. After weeks of heavy fighting, Alexander finally managed to return to the dugout. It was abandoned. The stretcher bearer was gone, his fate unknown. But just as Alexander turned to leave, he glimpsed something in a far corner. Reaching into the darkness, he discovered the violin in its case, partly covered by a ragged blanket. When one of the violin's strings snapped in the cold one day, a fellow soldier came to the rescue. "Nothing that a bit of wire won't fix," he said with a shrug, carefully unravelling a strand from a field telephone. Alexander was able to use it as a temporary violin string. Christmas approached, and the soldiers huddled, frostbitten and exhausted, in their dugouts. However, when Alexander softly played the first Noel, they could ignore for a while the sound of gunfire and their fears for the future. For many, their thoughts returned to summer picnics and good times at home. Late one night, after playing the violin, Alexander was creeping back to his dugout when he had a feeling of imminent danger. He froze. Bullets skimmed past his body. Had he moved his arm a fraction, the violin case would have been shattered. One step forward and he would have been killed. Not long afterwards, the soldiers received a sudden order to return to the beaches. Alexander had to leave the violin behind. Reluctantly, he scribbled a hasty note, asking another soldier to try to look after it if you can. When the last of the battered troops were being evacuated from Gallipoli, an Australian officer happened to see the violin. The soldier carrying it held his breath. Would he be ordered to toss it into the sea? To his astonishment, the officer muttered, "Shove it in with my stuff. Some chaps get attached to these things." When the violin was returned to Alexander, he printed 3 more place names inside the violin case. "These could be the last," he said, having heard about fierce fighting on the battlefields of Europe. Some time later, the soldiers were sent to the battlefields. They found the trenches were waterlogged and offered little protection from enemy fire. Once again, Alexander had to leave the violin. This time, he entrusted it to some nursing sisters in a hospice a short distance from the front line. When he eventually returned to collect the violin, he was surprised to find it in better condition than he had left it. "As well as nursing the wounded, I think someone has been keeping this violin in tune," he exclaimed. The long ward in the old stone hospice echoed to the sister's favourite melody, which he played as a gesture of thanks and farewell. Before returning to the battlefront, Alexander managed to borrow a bicycle and pedalled to a music shop in a nearby village. He knocked on the door. No one answered. Just as he was about to leave empty-handed, the elderly owners peered through a crack in the door. They expected to see soldiers with guns. Instead, they were astonished to find a young soldier from the other side of the world wanting to replace a worn violin bow and set of strings. They did all they could to help him, and he never forgot their kindness. Alexander had been put in command of a company of soldiers. Knowing heavy fighting lay ahead, he gave the violin to one of his men based at the camp. He felt it would be the last time he saw it, as he and his comrades marched towards the battlefields of the Somme in France. While leading his men into battle, Alexander was caught in enemy crossfire. Wounded, he collapsed into a muddy shell hole. Bullets hissed around him. For hours he lay in great pain, waiting for nightfall. If he moved in daylight, he would be killed. In the chaos, he was unsure of his position. He taught his men to recognise the stars in case they needed them for guidance. Now, using the polar star for direction, Alexander managed to crawl from shell hole to shell hole and finally to a trench out of range of enemy gunfire. Amidst the mud and mayhem, a doctor treated his wounds as best he could. But Alexander had been seriously injured. His days on the battlefront were over. He later wrote in his diary, "Then stretcher and ambulance and hospital train took me far away from the guns, which I never heard again in the Great War." Gradually, Alexander recovered from his injuries. When he was well enough to travel, he returned home on a hospital ship to Dunedin. He went back to university to study mathematics. As he struggled to forget his memories of war, he sought solace in music and the company of friends. Then, One day in 1918, a large package arrived at his home. It had been sent by one of the men he had fought alongside in the war. When Alexander unwrapped the package, there was the violin, carefully restored by a famous music firm in London. His mates, half a world away, had kept watch over the treasured violin, remembering the man and the music that had lightened their spirits during those dark days of war. Alexander Aitken later gifted the violin to his old school. He wrote, "It will outlive me, but it will be a reminder to all who see it of the service and sacrifice of New Zealanders in the First World War." Alexander Craig Aitken, 1895 to 1967, grew up in Dunedin and loved to explore the hills and bays of the Otago Peninsula. His grandparents farmed at Seal Point, and music was often the focus of family gatherings and community events. As the eldest son in a large family, Alec, as he was known, helped his father on his grocery delivery rounds. His father was well known for not writing down customers' orders, but accurately remembering them. He could very quickly add up accounts in his head, and sometimes challenged his son to see who could get the correct total first. Whether it was heredity, practice, or a combination of both, Alexander became known for his exceptional memory. At school, he was nicknamed Swatty because he excelled in most subjects, including mathematics. He could absorb information so quickly and remember it so clearly that it seemed as if he had a photographic memory. Many years after leaving Otago, he drew his favourite place on the peninsula. The details were correct, even to the exact number of fence posts. In his last year at school, Alexander learned the violin for one term with a tutor, and then taught himself from books and practising. Years later, he was described by an expert who heard him play as the most accomplished amateur musician he had ever known. Alexander's studies were interrupted by World War I. Although he wanted to join up straight away, his father would not let him enlist until his 20th birthday. On the 1st of April 1915, he joined up and, with many of his former schoolmates, served in Gallipoli and at the Somme. Many young men from all over the country lost their lives in that war, but Otago suffered particularly heavy losses. When a number of men Alexander had fought alongside were killed on the same day, a book containing information about them was also lost. How would their families back home be informed? Although still affected himself by the ordeal, Alexander was able to recite the names, regimental numbers, and addresses of all those involved. His exceptional memory proved both a gift and a burden. After the war, he could not forget some of the harrowing scenes he had witnessed. Alexander was a brilliant mathematician and won a scholarship to the University of Edinburgh, where he later became a professor. Living in Scotland for the rest of his life, he loved walking the hills as he had done on the Otago Peninsula when he was young. He married and had 2 children. As a test, they once asked him to multiply 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 by 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. He gave them the right answer in less than a minute. Although he earned fame from mathematics, he once said that most of the time his thoughts were of music. Alexander Aitken donated the violin he took to the war to his old school, Otago Boys High School, where it is now displayed with pride.